Sarah Morgan had stopped expecting to be noticed. At 53, she had perfected the art of occupying space without disturbing it. She moved through the Portland Public Library like a whisper, soft-soled shoes on worn carpet, fingers that knew exactly which floorboards creaked, a voice that never rose above the rustling of turned pages. Invisible. That's what she had become. Not the dramatic kind of invisibility you read about in stories, but the quiet, creeping kind that happens when you spend decades making yourself small enough that people simply forget you're there. But here's what Sarah didn't know. Someone had been watching. For 15 years, someone had been paying attention. And 3 weeks ago, that someone died. What he left behind wasn't just money. It was a question that would shatter everything Sarah believed about her invisible life. What if you weren't invisible at all? What if you were seen, truly seen, and the person who saw you decided you were worth everything? This is the story of Sarah Morgan, a woman who kept her words locked in drawers, a man who kept his admiration locked in silence, and a legacy that would force both their truths into the light. But before we begin, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible? Like your words, your talents, your dreams simply didn't matter to anyone? If you answered yes, even just in your head, then this story is especially for you, because Sarah lived 53 years feeling exactly that. And what happened to her might change how you see your own life. Now, if that question touched something in you, if you want to hear more stories that make you feel something real, leave a comment below. It can be just a word, an emotion, even an emoji. Why? Because this channel, Bittersweet Whispers, is building a community of people who believe stories matter, that connection matters, that being seen matters, and your comment, however small it seems, tells me these stories are reaching the people who need them. So, have you ever felt invisible? Now, let's meet Sarah. The Portland Public Library opened at 9 o'clock every Tuesday morning, just as it had for the past 47 years. Sarah Morgan arrived at 8:15, just as she had for the past 28. She unlocked the staff entrance, the door that stuck in winter, that required lifting the handle just slightly before turning the key, and stepped into the silence that belonged only to her. The building smelled the way old buildings do, paper and dust and time, with notes of coffee from the break room and something faintly sweet from the children's section, where yesterday's story hour had involved cookies. Sarah breathed it in like other people breathe ocean air. She hung her coat, navy blue, 10 years old, still perfectly serviceable, on the third hook from the left. Always the third hook. She placed her lunch bag, turkey sandwich, apple, thermos of tea in the small staff refrigerator. She turned on the lights row by row, watching the fluorescent tubes flicker to life like reluctant stars. And then she walked to the fiction section, ran her fingers along the spines of books that hadn't been checked out in months, and allowed herself the only indulgence of her morning routine. She pulled out the same book she pulled out every Tuesday, Pride and Prejudice. First edition replica. 1983 printing. She opened it to page 74, where years ago someone had pressed a forget-me-not between the pages, and she read the same passage she had read 100 times. There is a stubbornness about me that never can bear to be frightened at the will of others. My courage always rises at every attempt to intimidate me. Sarah touched the dried flower. She wondered, as she always did, who had left it there, who had loved this book enough to mark this particular page, who had needed Elizabeth Bennet's courage pressed into paper like a prayer. Then she closed the book, returned it to its place, and became invisible again. By 9:15, the library belonged to everyone. Mrs. Patterson came in first, as always, heading straight for the large print section without acknowledging Sarah beyond a vague nod that might have been intended for the circulation desk itself. Then came the college students, backpacks heavy, eyes glazed with exhaustion or caffeine or both, claiming tables like territories. By 10 o'clock, the children's section erupted with toddlers and tired mothers, and Sarah shelved returns in the quiet sections, the aisles where dust motes hung suspended in weak morning light filtering through tall windows. She knew these aisles better than she knew her own apartment. She knew that the floor in the poetry section dipped slightly near Dickinson, that the heating vent behind the travel books made a sound like soft breathing in winter, that the window by philosophy always stuck at exactly 3 inches open. She knew the books, too, not just their call numbers and authors, but their personalities, the mysteries that disappeared quickly, hungry for readers. The self-help books that sat untouched, their bright promises fading under dust. The poetry that moved slowly, loved deeply by a few. She knew the books, too. Not just their call numbers and authors, but their personalities. The mysteries that disappeared quickly, hungry for readers. The self-help books that sat untouched, their bright promises fading under dust. The poetry that moved slowly, loved deeply by a few. And she knew the people. The college girl, Amanda, who only checked out books about depression and anxiety. Sarah always placed a bookmark with the library's crisis hotline number inside each one. The elderly man, Mr. Hirsch, who came every Wednesday to read newspapers because his apartment was too quiet, his wife 3 years gone. Sarah always saved him the crossword section, unfolded. The mother with 3 boys under 7 who looked like she might cry from exhaustion. Sarah always found the longest picture books, the ones that would buy her 15 minutes of peace. Sarah saw them all. Every broken heart, every quiet struggle, every person who came to the library looking for something they couldn't name. But nobody saw Sarah. At noon, when the library hummed with its midday rush, Sarah took her lunch break in the staff room, a windowless box with a table, 3 chairs, and a microwave that had been broken since 2019. She ate her sandwich. She drank her tea. And then she pulled out the notebook. The same notebook she'd been filling for 23 years. Spiral-bound, plain cover, purchased from the drugstore in packs of 5. She was on notebook number 42. Inside, in her careful handwriting, were words that no one had ever read. Stories. 7 novels. Complete. Edited. Revised. Ready. Stories about lonely people finding connection. About invisible women becoming visible. About quiet courage and loud love and all the ways human hearts break and heal and break again. Stories that Sarah Morgan had been writing every lunch break, every evening, every Sunday afternoon for more than 2 decades. Stories that lived in her apartment in cardboard boxes, stacked in her closet like secrets too heavy to carry but too precious to throw away. She had never shown them to anyone. Not because they weren't good, though Sarah couldn't quite believe they were. Not because she didn't want them read, though the thought terrified her. But because showing them would require something Sarah had never been able to do, be seen. To publish was to say, I am here, I have something to say, I matter. And Sarah Morgan had spent 53 years learning that she didn't. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't see from her peripheral invisibility, was that someone had been watching her for 15 years. Every day from 10 until 3, an elderly man sat at the table by the east window. The same table, the same chair, always with a book, always with a cup of tea from the thermos he brought, always with a slight smile that never quite faded. Jonathan Blake. To Sarah, he was just another regular. She knew he liked biographies on Fridays, that he preferred his tea lukewarm, that his birthday was April 3rd because she'd seen his library card once while processing renewals. She knew he was kind. He always reshelved his books correctly, always spoke softly, always thanked her with genuine warmth in the rare moments they interacted. Good morning, Miss Morgan. Have a lovely day, Miss Morgan. Never just morning or thanks. Always her name, spoken like it mattered. But Sarah didn't know who he was. Didn't know that Jonathan Blake had once been one of the most celebrated authors in America. Didn't know that 30 years ago his name appeared on bestseller lists and award ceremonies, that his novels were taught in universities, that critics called him the conscience of American literature. She didn't know about the scandal that destroyed him, the plagiarism accusation that ended his career, the silence he chose instead of defense, the 30 years he spent in exile from the literary world. And she especially didn't know this. Jonathan Blake came to the library every day to watch her work. He watched how she chose books for people, the perfect match every time, like she could read souls through reading habits. He watched her fingers on spines, reverent and gentle. He watched her smile to herself when she read beautiful passages while shelving. And one autumn afternoon, 6 years ago, he watched her forget something on the table when she left for her lunch break. A notebook. Jonathan sat very still for several minutes, looking at it. The library around him hummed with life. Children laughing, keyboards clicking, the ancient heating system groaning to life. But all he heard was the question, should I? He shouldn't. He knew that. Privacy mattered. Boundaries mattered. But something about the way Sarah had tucked that notebook under her arm every day for months, the way she guarded it like treasure, the way she wrote with such fierce concentration during her lunch breaks. He opened it and read. 3 pages, that's all. Just the first 3 pages of whatever story lived inside. And Jonathan Blake, who had spent 30 years believing he would never be surprised by literature again, felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Recognition. This wasn't good writing. This was true writing, the kind that doesn't come from technique but from necessity, from a soul that needed to speak or suffocate. He closed the notebook carefully, placed it exactly where Sarah had left it, and returned to his table by the window. The next day, tucked into the pages of a book Sarah was about to shelve, she found a note on plain paper, handwritten in elegant script. Continue writing. The world needs these words. No signature. No explanation. Sarah kept that note in her wallet for 6 years. She never knew who wrote it, but on the hardest days, the days when the blank page felt like an accusation, when her own voice sounded stupid in her head, she pulled it out and read it again. The world needs these words. Someone, somewhere, believed that. It was enough to keep going. The first Tuesday in October, Jonathan Blake didn't come to the library. Sarah noticed immediately, not consciously, not in a way she could articulate, but in the way you notice when a familiar sound stops. The library felt wrong somehow. Off balance. She told herself it was nothing. People got sick. People had appointments. People had lives beyond the library. But Wednesday came, and his chair sat empty. Thursday, Friday, the following Monday. Sarah found herself looking at that table by the east window more often than she should. Found herself wondering if he was ill, if something had happened, But she didn't have his phone number, didn't know his address, didn't even know much beyond what she'd glimpsed on his library card. Blake, Jonathan, born 1944. She only knew that the library felt emptier without him, and that feeling, that noticing, unsettled her, because Sarah Morgan had spent 28 years not noticing the absences, not allowing herself to care when regulars stopped coming, stopped existing in her careful peripheral world. Caring was dangerous. Caring made you visible. But she kept looking at that empty chair, and she couldn't seem to stop. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain and old paper, a man walked into the Portland Public Library at 9:47. He wore a suit. Not the kind of suit people wore to libraries. The kind of suit people wore to courtrooms and boardrooms and places where money made decisions. He walked directly to the circulation desk. He asked for Sarah Morgan by name, and when she approached, reluctant, confused, already apologizing for whatever she must have done wrong, he said 5 words that didn't make any sense. "Ms. Morgan, I'm Jonathan Blake's attorney." Sarah blinked. "I'm sorry. Who?" "Jonathan Blake. He was a regular patron here. I believe you knew him." The man by the window. The tea. The gentle smile. The birthday in April. Is he okay?" The attorney's expression shifted into something rehearsed, professional, kind in the way lawyers learn to be kind, efficient and careful and ultimately distant. I'm very sorry to inform you that Mr. Blake passed away 3 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer. It was relatively quick. The library continued around them. Children laughing. Computers humming. Life flowing forward. But Sarah stood very still, feeling something crack inside her chest that she didn't know was there to break. "I'm sorry," she whispered, to the attorney, to herself, to the empty chair by the east window. "Miss Morgan, Mr. Blake left specific instructions regarding his estate. You're named in his will. I need to schedule a formal reading with you present." The words made no sense. None of them. Sarah shook her head slightly, the way you shake off a dream that clings too long after waking. "There must be a mistake. I didn't. I barely knew him. We never even really talked." The attorney pulled an envelope from his briefcase. Thick cream paper. Her name written across the front in elegant script that she recognized instantly. The same script from the note. The note she'd carried for 6 years. Continue writing. The world needs these words. "There's no mistake, Miss Morgan. Mr. Blake was very clear. He left you a letter. He asked that you read it before the formal will reading." The attorney extended the envelope. "My office is prepared to meet at your earliest convenience, but he wanted you to have this first. He said, and I quote, that you would need time." Sarah took the envelope with hands that had forgotten how to be steady. The paper felt expensive, important, too heavy for her invisible fingers. "I don't understand," she said, but the attorney was already writing something on a business card, already moving with the efficient grace of someone who had delivered difficult news before and would again. "My direct number. Call when you're ready. But Miss Morgan?" He paused, and for the first time, something genuine flickered in his professional expression. "He spoke very highly of you. Whatever's in that letter, whatever he left you, he wanted you to have it. He was absolutely certain about that." And then he was gone, and Sarah stood at the circulation desk holding an envelope that weighed nothing and everything, and somewhere in the back of the library a child laughed and the fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song, and the world kept turning while Sarah Morgan's world had just stopped completely. She looked at the envelope, at her name in Jonathan Blake's handwriting, at the sealed flap that held words she suddenly wasn't sure she wanted to read, because reading meant knowing, and knowing meant something had changed. And change, Sarah had learned long ago, was just another word for loss. But she thought about the empty chair by the east window, about the note she'd carried for 6 years, about a man who said good morning like her name mattered. And she thought, maybe, just maybe, some changes were different. Some changes were the opposite of loss. She slipped the envelope into her cardigan pocket, feeling its weight against her heart, and returned to shelving books because that's what invisible people do. They keep moving. They keep working. They keep pretending the ground beneath them hasn't just shifted into something new and terrifying and impossibly hopeful. And in her pocket, against her heart, Jonathan Blake's final words waited to be read. "You know what strikes me most about Sarah's story? She kept her gift hidden, not because it wasn't good enough, but because she was waiting for permission, waiting for someone to tell her it was okay to be seen. And I think a lot of us do that, don't we? We wait for the right moment, for more confidence, for someone to discover us first. But here's what Jonathan understood, and what Sarah learned. Sometimes you have to choose to be seen, even when it's terrifying, even when you're not ready, even when the world hasn't noticed you yet. If you're watching this, if you made it this far into Sarah's story, I think you're someone who values depth, real emotion, stories that make you feel something true, not just entertained. And if that's you, if you want more stories like this, stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark, subscribe. Not because I'm asking for a favor, but because you're choosing to say, yes, this matters. Stories with soul matter. I want to be part of a community that believes that. That's what this channel is. A place for stories that make you feel seen. that remind you you're not alone, that give you permission to feel deeply in a world that often asks us to feel nothing at all. So if that resonates, stay. Join us. Because Sarah's about to discover something that will change everything, and I don't want you to miss it. Sarah didn't open the envelope that night. She carried it home on the bus, the number 17 that smelled like rain and rubber and other people's exhaustion, and she held it in her lap like something fragile, like something that might break if she gripped too hard or disappear if she did not hold tight enough. The other passengers ignored her, as they always did, and Sarah was grateful for the invisibility that suddenly felt less like safety and more like loneliness. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Studio, 4th floor, no elevator, kitchenette with 2 burners and a microwave, bathroom with tiles from 1987, one window that looked out onto the parking lot of a dental office, rent controlled, which meant affordable, which meant small, which meant hers, the only space in the world that belonged entirely to Sarah Morgan. She set the envelope on the small table by the window, made tea, microwaved leftover rice, ate without tasting, washed the dishes, changed into pajamas, soft cotton worn thin from a decade of washing, brushed her teeth, set her alarm for 6:30, did all the small rituals that made up the architecture of her invisible life, and still the envelope sat there, cream paper glowing slightly in the light from the dental office parking lot, and Sarah couldn't bring herself to open it. She knew, with the certainty that comes from spending 53 years learning to read the world from the edges, that opening that envelope would change something, would crack open the careful shell she'd built around herself, the shell that kept her safe and small and unnoticed. And change, Sarah had learned, was dangerous. Change required being seen. So she went to bed, lay in the dark, stared at the ceiling with its water stain shaped like a bird in flight, and thought about Jonathan Blake. About "Good morning, Miss Morgan." About the empty chair by the east window. About a note she'd carried for 6 years, words that had kept her writing when everything else said stop. Continue writing. The world needs these words. Who was he? Really? Not the kind man with the tea and the gentle smile, but the person who wrote those words. The person who noticed her when nobody else did. The person who thought she mattered enough to put her name in his will. Sarah got out of bed at 2:17 in the morning. She made more tea. She sat at the small table by the window, and with hands that trembled only slightly, she opened the envelope. Inside were 15 pages, handwritten in the same elegant script, on the same cream-colored paper. The pages were numbered in the top right corner. On the first page, centered at the top, were 3 words. For Sarah Morgan. She began to read. Dear Sarah, though I suspect I've lost the right to call you that, having observed you all these years without your knowledge or permission. Dear Ms. Morgan feels too formal for what I need to say, and yet perhaps formality is what I deserve. Forgive me. I'm discovering that writing final letters is harder than writing novels. Novels let you revise. Life only gives you one draft. I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, the kind where doctors use words like comfortable instead of cured. I have perhaps 2 months, perhaps less. I'm writing this on a Tuesday afternoon, and I can see you from my table by the window. You're shelving books in the poetry section, and you just smiled at something you read. I've watched you do that 1,000 times, and it never stops making me believe in the essential goodness of human beings. You don't know who I am. Not really. To you, I'm just another regular. The old man with the tea and the biographies. But let me tell you who I actually am, or was, or tried to be. My name is Jonathan Blake. 30 years ago, I was a novelist, a successful one. My books won awards, sold well, were taught in universities. Critics were kind, readers were kinder. I thought I understood literature. I thought I understood truth. I was wrong about both. 30 years ago, I was accused of plagiarism. The accusation was true. Not in the way people thought, but true nonetheless. I stole passages from my wife's unpublished manuscript, passages she'd written before her death, passages I convinced myself she would have wanted me to use. I was grief-stricken and arrogant and desperate to keep writing, to keep mattering. So I took her words and called them mine. When the accusation came, I could have defended myself, could have explained. But explaining meant exposing Margaret's work to scrutiny, meant letting strangers pick apart her private words, meant turning her art into evidence. I couldn't do that to her, wouldn't. So I stayed silent, let my career end, let my name become synonymous with fraud. And I stopped writing. For 30 years, I stopped writing. And then, 15 years ago, I walked into the Portland Public Library looking for a quiet place to read away the hours of a life that had lost its purpose. And I saw you. You were shelving books. Nothing remarkable in that. But the way you touched them, Sarah, like they were living things, like each one mattered. And then I watched you help a young woman find a book, and you didn't just hand her what she asked for. You listened to what she wasn't saying, the loneliness under the request, and you gave her the book she actually needed. I kept coming back, day after day, not for the books, for you, to watch you see people, really see them, the broken college student, the widower, the exhausted mother. You saw them all, and you helped them all, and you did it invisibly, asking nothing, expecting no recognition. You were everything I'd tried to be as a writer and failed. You were truth without performance, love without applause. And then, 6 years ago, you left your notebook on the table. I know I shouldn't have read it. I know, but I did. 3 pages. Just 3 pages of whatever story you were writing. And, Sarah, I wept. Right there in the library, this old man crying over words written by someone who didn't even know I existed. Because those 3 pages had something I'd been chasing my entire career and never found. Absolute honesty. No artifice. No performance. Just truth poured onto paper because it had to go somewhere or suffocate you. I left you a note. Anonymous. Cowardly. Continue writing. The world needs these words. I meant it. Every syllable. Over the years, you forgot your notebook several more times. Twice more, I confess, I read. Always just a few pages. Always left devastated by your talent. You write the way some people pray, Sarah. Like you're speaking to something larger than yourself, asking to be heard, hoping to be forgiven. And you kept writing. Lunch breaks. Early mornings, I imagine. Late nights. You kept writing. And I kept watching. And I kept believing that someday, somehow, the world would discover what I'd discovered. That Sarah Morgan was one of the truest voices in American literature, and she'd been hiding in plain sight for decades. I'm dying now, and I find I cannot die knowing that your words will die with you, buried in notebooks and boxes, unread. I cannot bear the thought of the world losing what you could give it. So I'm doing something presumptuous, something you may hate me for. I'm taking your choice away, and I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry enough to stop. I'm leaving you my estate. Not all of it. There are charities and distant cousins who need something too, but the substantial portion, $18 million, the royalties from my books, which still sell steadily, my apartment, and, more importantly, Sarah, I'm leaving you a mission. I've contacted my former publisher. They're waiting for your manuscripts. All 7 of them. Yes, I know there are 7. Yes, I pieced together over the years which notebooks contained which stories. I made notes, extensive notes. They're in the apartment, organized, ready for you. The publisher has agreed to read them based solely on my recommendation. And Sarah, if your words are half as powerful in full as they were in those stolen glimpses, they'll publish. They'll publish all 7. But here's the condition, and I know this is where you'll want to refuse everything. You must allow them to be published. You must agree to at least one public appearance at the launch of the first book. You must step out of the shadows, just once, and let yourself be seen. I know what I'm asking. I've watched you for 15 years. I know your fear isn't about criticism or rejection. It's about visibility itself, about being perceived, about mattering in a way that can't be ignored or explained away. But Sarah, you've been invisible long enough. You've hidden long enough. And I think, though I could be wrong, that you're tired. Tired of the smallness, tired of the silence, tired of believing that your voice doesn't deserve to be heard. Your voice deserves to be heard. I'm giving you permission. No, not permission. I'm giving you inevitability. I'm making it so that unless you actively refuse everything, your work will be published. The wheels are in motion. The editor is waiting. All you have to do is not stop it. And if you're angry at me for this, if you feel manipulated or exposed or furious at my presumption, good. Be angry. Anger makes noise. Anger is visible. Let yourself be angry. Let yourself be anything except invisible. I don't know you, not really. We exchanged perhaps 100 words in 15 years. Good morning. Have a lovely day. Thank you. Such small words. But I know your writing, Sarah, and your writing tells me who you are. Kind, observant, brave in ways you don't recognize as bravery, capable of extraordinary love expressed through quiet attention. The world needs more people like you. The world needs your stories. And I need to die knowing I did one thing right with my life after 30 years of hiding. I need to know I helped truth reach the people who need to hear it. So that's what this is. My last act as a writer who lost his way. My attempt at redemption. My hope that you'll forgive me, or at least understand. There's more to tell you. About my life. About why I really stopped writing. About Margaret and what she meant and what I lost. It's all in documents my attorney will give you. Evidence that might, if you choose, clear my name. But that's not important anymore. What's important is you. Be brave, Sarah, just once. Just this once. Let yourself be seen. The world is waiting. With admiration, with hope, with apologies and gratitude, Jonathan Blake, P. S. The apartment has a piano. I don't play. I bought it because I read once that you played as a child, something you mentioned to a patron years ago, something you probably don't remember saying. I thought perhaps you'd like to play again. Consider it a gift, or a bribe, or an old man's foolish hope that you might fill that space with something beautiful. Sarah read all 15 pages without stopping, without breathing properly, without letting herself think about what the words meant. And when she finished, when she reached the end where Jonathan's signature trembled slightly, evidence of the illness that would kill him weeks later, she folded the pages, carefully returned them to the envelope, and sat very still as the sun rose over the parking lot of the dental office. Someone had seen her. For 15 years, someone had watched her invisible life and decided it was worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth $18 million and a piano and the presumption of changing her entire existence. Sarah put her head down on the table and cried for the first time in 7 years. Cried for Jonathan Blake, who died believing she mattered. Cried for herself, who had spent 53 years believing she didn't. Cried for all the words she'd written that no one had read, and all the words she'd never write if she stayed invisible forever. And when she was done crying, when the sun had fully risen and the world had started its daily turning, Sarah Morgan made a phone call to an attorney whose business card was crisp and expensive in her trembling hand. The office was downtown, 19th floor, glass and steel and the kind of silence that money buys. Sarah wore her best cardigan, navy blue, and her least worn shoes, and she felt small in the elevator, smaller in the lobby, smallest of all sitting across from Jonathan Blake's attorney in a conference room that had a view of the entire city. Ms. Morgan, thank you for coming. I'm Michael Warner. I handled Mr. Blake's affairs for the last 20 years. He was younger than she expected. Mid-40s, kind eyes, the efficiency of someone who dealt with death professionally but hadn't yet learned to be numb to it. He opened a folder. Neat, organized. The kind of organization that suggested this meeting had been planned long before Jonathan died. I'll be direct. Mr. Blake's will is unusual, but very clear. He's leaving you $18 million, paid out in a trust that will provide you with approximately $60,000 monthly for life, with the principal preserved for charitable distribution upon your death as you see fit. Additionally, you inherit his apartment, furnishings included, property taxes paid from the trust in perpetuity. You also inherit the royalties from his published works, which currently generate approximately $200,000 annually. Sarah couldn't breathe properly. The numbers were too big, too impossible. 18,060,000 monthly, 200,000 annually. These were numbers that happened to other people, not to invisible librarians who ate turkey sandwiches from baggies. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why?" Michael Warner's expression softened. "He explained in his letter, I assume. He said I write. But that's not, I'm nobody." "Miss Morgan." Michael Warner leaned forward slightly. "Jonathan Blake doesn't leave $18 million to nobody. He was many things, not all of them admirable by his own admission, but he wasn't careless with his legacy. If he left this to you, it's because he believed you deserved it. But there's a condition," Sarah said, remembering, "about publishing. Yes, the trust includes a clause. Your manuscripts, Mr. Blake identified 7 complete novels, must be submitted to Ashford and Gray Publishing within 90 days. You must allow them to be published if Ashford accepts them, and you must agree to participate in at least one public event, a launch reading or interview for the first published book. If you refuse these conditions, the inheritance defaults to secondary beneficiaries. And if I refuse? Then you walk away with nothing. The money, the apartment, all of it goes to a combination of literary charities and distant relatives." He paused. "But, Miss Morgan, before you decide, I should tell you something. Jonathan Blake spent the last 6 months of his life preparing for this. He didn't just contact Ashford and Gray. He wrote a 15-page editorial letter detailing why your work matters. He made notes on each of your manuscripts, organized by novel, with suggestions not to change your words, but to help the publisher understand them. He essentially curated your entire body of work as if it were a museum exhibition." Michael Warner opened another folder. Inside were pages and pages of Jonathan's handwriting. Notes, observations. A sentence from what must be one of her novels, followed by, "Notice the way she captures loneliness not as absence, but as presence. The reader feels the weight of being alone. This is mastery." Sarah's hands trembled. "He did all this?" "He did all this. He believed in you, Miss Morgan, profoundly. The question is, do you believe in him? Do you trust his judgment enough to take this risk?" Sarah thought about the empty chair by the east window. About, "Good morning, Miss Morgan." About a note she'd carried for 6 years. About a man who spent his last months on Earth trying to make sure her words didn't die with her. "Can I see the apartment first?" she asked quietly. "Before I decide?" Michael Warner smiled. "He said you'd ask that. I have the keys." The apartment was in the Pearl District in a building that had been a warehouse once, and was now the kind of place where people with money lived in exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows. 19th floor. Corner unit. Michael Warner unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting Sarah enter first. She stepped into light. That was the first thing she noticed. Windows everywhere flooding the space with October afternoon sun. Hardwood floors, white walls, books, thousands of books lining custom shelves that covered every wall that wasn't glass. And in the corner, by the largest window, a piano. Black, grand, beautiful. Sarah walked slowly through the space. The kitchen, small but perfect, equipment for someone who cooked seriously. The bedroom, simple, a bed with white linens and a nightstand with a reading lamp and reading glasses. The bathroom with a clawfoot tub. And the study. The study took her breath away. 3 walls of books. A desk, antique oak, facing the window. And on the desk, organized in neat stacks, were her notebooks. All 42 of them. Sarah recognized them instantly. the cheap spiral-bound drugstore notebooks that held 23 years of secret words. Beside them, in matching stacks, were typed pages, Jonathan's notes, meticulously organized by novel. On top of the first stack was a single page with one sentence. "Start here, Sarah. The world is waiting." She picked up the first notebook, the one that held the beginning of her first novel, written when she was 30 years old and still believed she might matter. She opened it. In the margin of the first page, in Jonathan's handwriting, "First line is perfect. Don't change it." Sarah sank into the desk chair. It fit her perfectly, adjusted to exactly the right height, as if Jonathan had measured her somehow, planned for this moment. Through the window, Portland spread out below her, visible and present and alive. She could see the library from here, the small building where she'd spent 28 years being invisible. It looked so small from up here, so distant. Michael Warner stood in the doorway. "He left you a space to write, Miss Morgan, and an audience to write for. The question is whether you'll use it." Sarah looked at the notebooks, at Jonathan's notes, at the piano in the corner and the books on the walls and the life that someone had built for her without her knowledge or permission. And she thought about invisibility, about safety, about the small apartment with the view of the dental office parking lot, about turkey sandwiches and baggies and a coat on the third hook from the left. She thought about what Jonathan had written. "Be brave, Sarah. Just once. Let yourself be seen. I need time," she said. "You have 90 days. The clock started the day Mr. Blake died. That gives you 67 days remaining. 67 days to decide whether to step into the light or remain in the shadows. 67 days to choose between safety and truth. 67 days to be brave just once." Sarah stood, walked to the piano, lifted the fallboard. The keys were perfect, ivory and ebony, gleaming in the afternoon light. She pressed middle C. The note rang out pure and clear, filling the apartment with sound. She hadn't played in 42 years, since before her mother got sick, since before she learned that wanting things was dangerous, since before she became invisible. Her fingers found a chord, then another. Muscle memory older than grief. A simple melody, something she'd learned as a child. It was clumsy, unpracticed, full of hesitation, but it was sound. It was presence. It was the opposite of invisible. Michael Warner said nothing, just watched. And when Sarah finally stopped, when the last note faded into silence, he asked, "What will you do, Miss Morgan?" Sarah looked at the piano, at the notebooks on the desk, at the city spread below her, full of people who didn't know she existed. Yet. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'd like the keys to the apartment, to think here, if that's allowed." "It's your apartment, Miss Morgan. Everything here is already yours. You just have to decide whether you'll accept it." Michael Warner handed her the keys. Heavy. Real. The weight of a choice that hadn't been made yet but was getting closer. And as Sarah closed her hand around them, feeling the metal warm against her palm, she thought maybe, just maybe, Jonathan Blake had been right about one thing. She was tired. So tired of being invisible. So tired of believing she didn't matter. So tired of hiding words that wanted, desperately, to be read. Maybe 67 days was enough time to learn how to be brave. Maybe it was enough time to learn how to be seen. Sarah passed the next days divided between the library where she still worked and the apartment, Jonathan's apartment, her apartment. She began to read his notes about her manuscripts. He hadn't just read, but analyzed profundly, with respectful and complimentary literary criticism. He saw in her what she'd never seen in herself. She also found documents about Jonathan's scandal, evidence that would prove his version of the story, that he chose to stay silent to protect the memory of his dead wife. Sarah began to understand. Jonathan sacrificed everything for love, and she was hiding everything out of fear. Sarah tried to play piano again. It was difficult, painful, but something in her began to awaken. She tentatively decided to accept the inheritance, but with the intention of publishing and then somehow refusing the public appearances. She called Ashford and Gray Publishing. The editor, Victoria Hayes, a woman in her 60s, direct but kind, asked to meet. At the meeting, Victoria revealed, "Jonathan Blake never recommended anything to me in 30 years. If he thought you were worth it, I trust him. Send the manuscripts." Sarah sent them, and then began the agonizing wait. During this wait, she continued working at the library, but everything seemed different now. She was beginning to see her own life from the outside, to see how small it had become. One afternoon, she received the call. Victoria wanted to publish. All 7 books. She wanted Sarah in the office immediately. 3 weeks later, her phone rang at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. Sarah was at the apartment, attempting Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major and failing beautifully. She didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. "Miss Morgan, this is Victoria Hayes. I hope it's not too late." Victoria Hayes. The Victoria Hayes, editor-in-chief of Ashford and Gray, one of the most respected literary publishers in America. The woman whose editorial letters were studied in graduate programs, whose eye for talent had launched dozens of major careers. Sarah's hands went cold. "No, it's fine. I'm awake." "Good. I'll be direct because that's how I am and because you deserve directness. I've read your manuscripts. All 7. I've also read Jonathan's notes, which were unnecessary, because your work speaks perfectly well for itself, but they were illuminating nonetheless. Miss Morgan, I want to publish. All 7 novels. I'm offering you a 7-book deal." The apartment tilted slightly. Sarah sat down on the piano bench. "I'm sorry, what?" "A 7-book deal. Simultaneous publication schedule. 1 book every 6 months over 3.5 years. Aggressive, I know, but your books deserve to be out in the world, and I don't want to wait 10 years to publish them all. We'll start with The Weight of Invisible Things." That was Sarah's first novel, the one she'd written at 30, the one about a woman learning to take up space. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "They're good enough." Victoria Hayes laughed, warm and genuine. "Good enough? Miss Morgan, they're extraordinary. Jonathan wasn't exaggerating. If anything, he undersold you. Your work is quiet and devastating and absolutely true. You write about loneliness the way most people can't, because you understand it's not absence, but presence. You write about invisible people with such care, such attention, that they become the most visible people on the page. This is the kind of writing that changes readers." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't process. All 7 books, published, real, out in the world where people could read them. "Miss Morgan, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm sorry, this is unexpected. I imagine it is. But here's what needs to happen next. I need you in New York, as soon as possible. We need to discuss publication strategy, cover design, marketing, and we need to talk about your author bio and the publicity requirements. I know Jonathan's will stipulated 1 public appearance. We'll need to plan that carefully. New York. Sarah had never been to New York, had never been anywhere really. The idea of getting on a plane, flying across the country, meeting with publishers and publicists and people who would want to know who she was, terrified her more than anything. But she'd promised, and Victoria Hayes wanted to publish her books, all 7 of them. "When?" Sarah asked. "How's Friday? I can have my assistant book you a flight and hotel. We'll cover all expenses, of course." Friday, 3 days away. 3 days to prepare for visibility, for being seen, for stepping into a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "Friday works," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Excellent. Expect an email within the hour with all the details. And, Miss Morgan, congratulations. Jonathan was right about you. You're going to matter." The call ended. Sarah sat on the piano bench in Jonathan's apartment, in the silence that followed those words. "You're going to matter." As if she hadn't mattered before, As if the 28 years at the library, the careful attention to broken patrons, the quiet kindness, the 7 novels written in secret, hadn't mattered. But she understood what Victoria meant. She was going to matter publicly, visibly, in a way that couldn't be ignored or overlooked or forgotten. The thought was terrifying. And somewhere underneath the terror, something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. Sarah stood, walked to the window, looked out at Portland, at the city she'd lived in for 53 years without ever really occupying. From up here, from the 19th floor, everything looked small. The library, her old apartment, the bus routes she'd memorized, her entire invisible life, compressed into a grid of lights and streets. She thought about Jonathan. About "Good morning, Miss Morgan." About 15 years of watching someone who thought she was invisible. About a man who spent his last months trying to make sure she'd be seen. Be brave, Sarah. Just once. She was going to New York. She was going to meet with publishers. She was going to let her books be published. She was going to fulfill the requirement of one public appearance, standing in front of strangers, reading her own words aloud, being visible in a way that made her skin crawl just thinking about it. But she was going to do it. For Jonathan. For the 7 novels that deserved to be read. For the version of herself that existed in his notes, the writer he believed in. And maybe, just maybe, for herself. Friday arrived with rain. Sarah stood in her small apartment, the old one with the view of the dental office parking lot, and packed a suitcase. Professional clothes, the kind she'd bought for a funeral 10 years ago and never worn since. A notebook, blank, in case inspiration struck. Her wallet with the note she'd carried for 6 years. Continue writing. The world needs these words. The airport was overwhelming. Crowds and noise and announcements and security lines. Sarah wanted to turn around, go home, call Victoria Hayes and say she'd changed her mind. The manuscripts were a mistake. Please forget she existed. But she got on the plane, sat in seat 23A, watched Portland disappear beneath clouds. And when the plane touched down at JFK 5 hours later, when Sarah stepped out into New York City with its impossible noise and impossible crowds and impossible visibility, she thought, this is it. This is the moment where invisible Sarah Morgan stops existing and someone new takes her place. She didn't know yet if she was ready for that someone, didn't know if she could be brave enough. But she was here. That had to count for something. The city swallowed her whole. Taxis and skyscrapers and people who walked too fast and talked too loud. Sarah checked into the hotel Victoria's assistant had booked, a boutique place in Midtown, and stood in the room looking out at a city that had never heard of her and never would have, if not for Jonathan Blake. Her phone buzzed. Email from Victoria. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Looking forward to meeting you. Tomorrow, 10 hours. 10 hours until Sarah Morgan, invisible librarian, walked into one of the most prestigious publishing houses in America and became officially, unavoidably, terrifyingly, an author. She sat on the hotel bed, looked at her hands. These hands had shelved books for 28 years, had written 7 novels in secret, had played piano as a child and then forgotten for 42 years. These hands had lived an invisible life. Tomorrow, these hands would sign a 7-book deal. Tomorrow, everything changed. Sarah lay back on the expensive hotel bed in a city that didn't know she existed yet, and she thought about Jonathan Blake, about watching someone invisible for 15 years, about believing in someone when they couldn't believe in themselves, about dying knowing you'd done one thing right. "I hope I make you proud," she whispered to the ceiling, to the memory of a man she'd barely known but who'd known her completely. "I hope this is what you wanted." The city hummed outside her window. Millions of people, millions of stories, millions of voices all talking at once. And tomorrow, Sarah Morgan's voice would join them, whether she was ready or not. The Ashford and Gray building was glass and steel and intimidation. 43 stories in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of building where important things happened, where careers were made or broken, where people who mattered made decisions that affected people who didn't. Sarah stood on the sidewalk outside, looking up, feeling impossibly small. Around her, New York moved at its relentless pace. People in expensive coats walking with purpose, taxis honking, the smell of street vendor coffee mixing with exhaust and ambition. Everyone here seemed to know exactly where they were going and why they mattered. Sarah didn't belong here. She belonged in Portland, in the quiet aisles of the library, invisible and safe. But she was here, and in 7 minutes she had an appointment that would change everything. She went inside. The lobby was marble and minimalist elegance. A receptionist who looked like she'd never had a self-doubt in her life directed Sarah to the elevators. 37th floor. The doors closed. Sarah watched the numbers climb and felt her stomach drop with each ascending digit. The elevator opened onto a space that was all white walls and natural light and beautiful people doing beautiful work. A young woman, mid-20s, impossibly chic, greeted her immediately. "Miss Morgan, I'm Rebecca, Ms. Hayes's assistant. She's ready for you. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Water, please," Sarah said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Rebecca led her through an open office space where people typed on expensive computers and talked on phones about manuscripts and deals and publicity. No one looked at Sarah. She was invisible here too, just another hopeful writer in a building full of them. Somehow, that was comforting. They reached a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Behind a massive desk sat Victoria Hayes, exactly as Sarah had imagined her. 62, gray hair cut sharply, minimal makeup, glasses that were somehow both practical and stylish. She stood when Sarah entered, came around the desk, extended her hand. "Sarah Morgan. Finally. Sit, please." Victoria's office was lined with books, hundreds of them. Some with jackets Sarah recognized, bestsellers and prize winners and the kind of books that mattered. Victoria's desk was organized chaos. Manuscripts, notes, coffee cups, a framed photo of 2 golden retrievers. "I'll get right to it because I respect your time and because small talk is nobody's friend," Victoria said, settling back into her chair. "Your books are exceptional, all 7 of them. I've been in this business for 34 years, and I can count on 2 hands the number of times I've read something that made me stop and think, this is important. Your work did that." Sarah's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Publishing is about to get complicated for you, Sarah. May I call you Sarah?" Sarah nodded. "Good. Here's what we're looking at. We'll launch with The Weight of Invisible Things in 6 months. That's aggressive, but your manuscript is clean, needs minimal editing. We'll do a modest first printing, 20,000 copies, but I have a feeling we'll need more. Your writing has the quality that creates word of mouth." Victoria pulled out a folder, opened it, slid papers across the desk. Publication timeline. Marketing budget, cover concepts. It was overwhelming and real, and suddenly Sarah's secret words were going to be books, physical objects, things people could hold. "We'll need an author photo, bio, social media presence, though we can keep that minimal if you prefer. I understand from Jonathan's notes that you're intensely private." Victoria's expression softened slightly. "He cared about you very much, you know. In all my years knowing Jonathan, I never saw him advocate for anyone the way he advocated for you." "You knew him?" "For 40 years. He was one of my first major acquisitions when I started as a junior editor. We stayed in touch, even after everything. He called me 6 months ago. Said he'd found the most important writer I'd ever publish and would I trust him one more time. I said yes. I'm glad I did." Sarah felt tears threatening and pushed them down. "I wish I'd known him better." "He knew you, Sarah. That's what mattered to him." Victoria paused, then continued. "Which brings me to the complicated part. The story behind your books, your connection to Jonathan, his legacy redemption through discovering you, this is powerful narrative. The invisible librarian writing in secret for decades, discovered posthumously by a literary legend trying to do one good thing before he died. Sarah, this is the kind of story that sells books. Something cold settled in Sarah's stomach. You want to use Jonathan. I want to tell the truth. Jonathan Blake championed you. He staked his final act on your talent. That's not exploitation. That's honoring his choice. But yes, we need to tell that story. Not just for sales, though that matters, but because it's part of the narrative. Your books are about invisible people. You were invisible. Jonathan saw you. That circularity, that poetry, readers will respond to that. And if I say no? Victoria's expression hardened slightly, professional warmth replaced by business reality. Then we publish quietly, modest marketing, hope for organic growth. Your books are good enough to find readers eventually. But Sarah, eventually might be years, decades, and by then the moment is lost. Jonathan's advocacy is news now. In a year, no one will care. You have a window where your story matters to people beyond just the literary community. I'm advising you to use it. Sarah looked at the contracts on the desk. 7 books. Her entire secret life bound in legal language and publication schedules. I don't want to be famous. I know, but you want to be read, don't you? You wrote 7 novels. You didn't write them to hide them forever. Jonathan understood that. He gave you permission to be seen. The question is whether you'll accept it. Sarah thought about the note she'd carried for 6 years, about Jonathan's letter, about "Be brave, Sarah, just once." What would I have to do? Standard publicity, interview with Publishers Weekly, possibly NPR if we can secure it, and the launch event. We're thinking Portland, your hometown, at the library where you worked. Symbolic. You'd read an excerpt, take questions, sign books. 90 minutes maximum. We'd keep it intimate, controlled. At the library, where everyone knew her as Invisible Sarah, where Mrs. Patterson ignored her and the college students never noticed her, and she'd spent 28 years being nobody. She'd have to stand in front of all of them and read her words aloud and be seen. The thought made her nauseous. I need time to think. You have until Monday. Contracts need to be signed by then, or the deal evaporates. I'm sorry to pressure you, but that's the reality. Publishing moves fast, or it doesn't move at all. Sarah left the office 40 minutes later with a folder full of contracts and a head full of noise. She walked through Manhattan without seeing it, got back to her hotel, sat on the bed, and stared at nothing. Her phone rang. Portland area code, the library. Sarah, it's Margaret. Margaret was the head librarian, Sarah's supervisor for 15 years, a kind woman who mostly left Sarah alone. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I thought you'd want to know. Amanda collapsed this morning. She's at Providence Hospital. She asked for you. Amanda, the college student, the one who checked out books about depression and anxiety, the one Sarah had been quietly watching for 3 years, leaving crisis hotline bookmarks, choosing books that said, "You matter, you're not alone, please stay." What happened? Overdose, intentional. Her roommate found her. Sarah, she's going to be okay physically, but she's asking for you. I think you might be the only person at the library she feels sees her. Sarah caught the next flight home. Providence Hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. Amanda was in the psychiatric wing, under observation, pale against white sheets, looking impossibly young and broken. When she saw Sarah, she started crying. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I couldn't anymore. Sarah sat beside the bed, took Amanda's hand. It's okay. You're safe now. You always gave me the right books, Amanda whispered. Like you knew. Like you saw me. Nobody else saw me. I was invisible. But you saw me. Sarah's throat tightened. You were never invisible, Amanda. You mattered. You matter. I thought if someone like you, someone kind like you, if you saw me, maybe I wasn't completely worthless. The books you chose, they made me feel less alone. They kept me going, until they didn't. I'm sorry." Sarah stayed for 2 hours, talking, listening, just being present. And when she left, when she walked out of that hospital into Portland rain, she understood something she hadn't before. Being seen mattered. Seeing others mattered. Her quiet attention, her careful book selections, her invisible kindness. It had mattered to Amanda. Had maybe saved her before today. And her books, her 7 novels about lonely people finding connection, those could matter to other Amandas. Other invisible people who needed to know they weren't alone. But for her books to reach those people, she had to let herself be seen. Had to step into visibility. Had to accept that being brave meant being exposed. Sarah went home to Jonathan's apartment, sat at his desk, looked at the contracts she'd brought from New York. 7 books, 7 chances to make people feel seen, 7 opportunities to matter. She picked up a pen, signed her name on every contract. Sarah Morgan. Author, visible. She scanned the documents, emailed them to Victoria Hayes, and then sat very still, feeling the weight of what she'd just done. No going back now. The books would be published. The publicity would happen. The launch event at the library would force her to stand in front of everyone who'd never noticed her and be seen. Terrifying, but necessary. Her phone rang the next morning. Michael Warner, Jonathan's attorney. His voice was tense. "Miss Morgan, we have a problem. Jonathan's nephew, Richard Blake, is contesting the will. He's filed a lawsuit claiming you exercised undue influence over Jonathan while he was ill. He's alleging that you manipulated a vulnerable, dying man for financial gain." Sarah's stomach dropped. "That's not true. I barely knew him." "I know, but Richard is claiming that's impossible, that Jonathan wouldn't leave $18 million to someone he barely knew unless that person had manipulated him. He's asking for a full investigation, and Sarah, he's gone to the press." The article appeared online that afternoon. Opportunistic librarian exploits dying author. The story painted Sarah as a calculating predator who'd befriended a lonely, ill man and convinced him to change his will. Comments flooded in. Vicious, cruel. People who'd never met Sarah or Jonathan deciding she was a villain. Gold digger. Disgusting that people prey on the elderly like this. She should be in jail. Sarah read every comment, each one a knife. This was the opposite of invisible. This was being seen as a monster. Victoria Hayes called. "Sarah, I've seen the articles. This is bad, but it's manageable. We need to respond. Tell your side. The letter Jonathan left you, his editorial notes, the fact that he pursued you not the other way around, these are powerful defenses. Right now, you're a character in someone else's story. We need to make you real to people. More publicity, more exposure. Yes, I'm sorry, but yes. The alternative is letting Richard's narrative define you. And, Sarah, if that happens, your books will be tainted before they're even published. Readers won't be able to separate you from the controversy." Sarah hung up, sat in Jonathan's apartment surrounded by his books and his piano and his belief in her, and felt the walls closing in. She'd thought visibility meant standing at a podium reading her words. She hadn't understood it meant this: being attacked, being judged, being transformed from invisible to infamous. Her phone buzzed constantly. Reporters requesting comment, strangers sending hate mail to the library, the director calling to say maybe Sarah should take a leave of absence until things settled down. Everyone had an opinion about Sarah Morgan now. Everyone could see her, and what they saw was ugly. She stood at the window looking out at Portland, at the library in the distance, and thought about invisibility, about safety, about spending 28 years being nobody and how nobody could ever be hurt like this. She could refuse, walk away, return the money. Let the manuscripts disappear back into boxes. Go back to being invisible Sarah Morgan, who shelved books and ate turkey sandwiches and didn't matter to anyone except in quiet, unnoticed ways. She could be safe again. Her phone rang. Victoria Hayes. Sarah almost didn't answer, but she did. Sarah, I need an answer. We can draft a statement, arrange an interview, control the narrative. But I need to know you're willing to fight for this. Fight for Jonathan's legacy. Fight for your books. Because if you're not, if you're going to walk away, tell me now so we can minimize damage. Sarah looked at the piano, at the contracts signed with her name, at the stack of manuscripts with Jonathan's notes, at the life he'd built for her believing she was brave enough to live it. She thought about Amanda in the hospital. You saw me. Nobody else saw me. She thought about invisible people everywhere writing words in secret, believing they didn't matter, waiting for permission to be seen. She thought about Jonathan Blake, who sacrificed everything to protect someone he loved, who spent his last months trying to save someone he barely knew. Be brave, Sarah. Just once. Tell me what I need to do, Sarah said, her voice steady for the first time in days. We start with the truth. All of it. Jonathan's letter, his notes, the real story of who you are and why he believed in you. We make them see you, really see you. Not the villain Richard's painting, but the person Jonathan knew you were. And if they don't believe me, then we fail. But Sarah, failing while fighting for the truth is better than succeeding by staying silent. Jonathan taught me that. 30 years ago, he chose silence over defense. It destroyed him. Don't make the same mistake. Sarah closed her eyes, breathed, opened them. Okay, I'll do it. I'll tell the story. All of it. Good. I'm sending a publicist to Portland tomorrow. Her name is Claire. She's the best. Trust her. And Sarah, thank you for being brave enough to finish what Jonathan started. The call ended. Sarah sat in the silence that followed. Tomorrow, Claire would arrive. Tomorrow, the process would begin of transforming invisible Sarah Morgan into a public figure. Tomorrow, the fighting would start. But tonight, she was still just Sarah, sitting in Jonathan's apartment, surrounded by evidence of his belief in her. She walked to the piano, sat down, placed her fingers on the keys, and she played. Not perfectly, not even well, but loudly, filling the apartment with sound, with presence, with the opposite of invisible. Outside, Portland went about its evening. People came home from work, made dinner, watched television, lived their small normal lives, and Sarah played piano in an apartment that used to belong to someone who saw her when she was nobody. Tomorrow, she'd fight. Tomorrow, she'd be brave. Tomorrow, she'd step fully into the light that Jonathan had tried to shine on her. But tonight, she grieved. For invisibility lost, for safety abandoned, for the quiet life she'd lived that was over now, completely and irrevocably over. The piano sang. Sarah cried, and somewhere she hoped Jonathan Blake was watching, proud that she hadn't run, proud that she was choosing visibility even when it hurt. Be brave, Sarah. Just once. She was trying. God, she was trying. Claire Martinez arrived on a Wednesday morning with the energy of someone who'd solved harder problems than Sarah Morgan. Mid-30s, power suit, immaculate makeup, the kind of woman who looked like she'd never doubted herself for a single second. She sat across from Sarah in Jonathan's apartment and didn't waste time on pleasantries. I've read everything. The articles, the accusations, Jonathan's letter to you. Your manuscripts, by the way, are stunning. Here's what we're dealing with. Richard Blake has successfully painted you as a predator. We need to repaint you as what you actually are. A woman who was seen by someone who mattered. That's our narrative. Seen, not seeking. Sarah's hands were folded in her lap, tight enough that her knuckles were white. How? Interview. Local paper first, Portland Tribune. Hometown angle. We show them who you are. Librarian for 28 years, wrote in secret, never sought Jonathan out. He found you, and we show them the letter, all 15 pages. Let Jonathan speak for himself. That letter is private. That letter is your defense, Sarah. And more than that, it's beautiful. It's a love letter. Not romantic, but something deeper. One artist recognizing another. People need to read it. They need to understand what Jonathan saw in you. Sarah looked out the window at Portland, at the city that was suddenly full of people who had opinions about her. What if they don't believe me? Some won't. That's fine. We're not trying to convince everyone. We're trying to reach the people who matter. Readers. The people who'll buy your books not because of scandal, but because of what's inside them. Trust me, Sarah, I've handled worse. The interview happened 2 days later. Portland Tribune sent a journalist named Marcus Chen, mid-40s, kind eyes, the type who listened more than he talked. He sat in Jonathan's apartment, recording device on the table between them, and asked Sarah to tell him everything. She did, haltingly at first, then with increasing steadiness. She told him about the library, about Jonathan's daily presence, about the note she'd carried for 6 years, about the day the attorney arrived, about the letter that changed everything. And then, with Claire's encouraging nod, she let Marcus read Jonathan's letter. All 15 pages. Marcus read in silence. When he finished, his eyes were wet. Ms. Morgan, anyone who reads this and still thinks you're a predator isn't worth convincing. This is one of the most moving things I've ever read. May I quote from it? Yes, Sarah said quietly. Jonathan wanted to be heard. I think he'd want people to know what he saw, even if what he saw wasn't really there. It was there, Marcus said firmly. I haven't read your books yet, but I will, and I suspect Jonathan was right about you. The article ran on Sunday. Front page, above the fold, with a photo of Sarah holding one of her manuscripts. The headline read, "The Librarian Who Was Seen, Jonathan Blake's Last Gift to Literature." It was fair, honest. It included Richard's accusations, but framed them as the bitter response of a man who'd expected an inheritance and got bypassed. It quoted extensively from Jonathan's letter, and it ended with a paragraph that made Sarah cry when she read it. Sarah Morgan spent 28 years being invisible. She shelved books and helped patrons and wrote 7 novels that no one read. She asked for nothing, expected nothing. And then Jonathan Blake, one of America's greatest literary voices, saw her. Really saw her. And he decided that his final act would be making sure the world saw her too. Whatever Richard Blake believes, whatever cynics might say, this much is clear. Jonathan Blake was nobody's fool. If he believed in Sarah Morgan, perhaps we should too. The comments section exploded. But differently now. People defending Sarah. People saying they wanted to read her books. People sharing their own stories of being invisible, of being seen, of being saved by someone who noticed them. The narrative was shifting. Not completely. There were still skeptics, still people who thought Sarah was lying, still Richard's lawsuit grinding through the courts. But the story was changing from predator and victim to something more complicated, more human. Claire called 3 days after the article. It's working. Pre-orders for your book are up 300%. Victoria wants to move the launch event to a bigger venue. The library can't hold the interest anymore. No, Sarah said immediately. It has to be the library. That's where Jonathan saw me. That's where it matters. Claire paused. Okay, but it's going to be crowded. Standing room only. Press. Cameras. Can you handle that? Sarah thought about Amanda in the hospital. About invisible people everywhere. About Jonathan's letter. I have to. The weeks before the launch were a blur of preparation. Claire coached her on public speaking. How to stand. How to breathe. How to read aloud without her voice shaking. Sarah practiced every day, reading passages from her book to the empty apartment, imagining the room full of people watching her. She failed constantly. Her voice would crack, her hands would shake. She'd lose her place on the page, but she kept trying. During this time, Sarah also kept exploring Jonathan's apartment, finding pieces of him in drawers and closets. She found his earlier will, dated 5 years before he died. In it, he left everything to literary charities. Nothing to her. This will had been changed after he'd read her manuscripts. He'd chosen her, specifically, deliberately, over everything else. She also found a box of letters, correspondence between Jonathan and Margaret from when they were young. Margaret's handwriting was elegant, her words sharp and beautiful. In one letter, dated 1995, Margaret wrote, "I think the greatest tragedy in literature is how much talent is wasted. How many brilliant writers are out there working jobs, raising kids, living invisible lives, never sharing their words because they don't have access, don't have connections, don't have someone saying, 'You matter.' If I ever have money, Jonathan, real money, I want to find those people. I want to discover the invisible ones." Sarah sat with that letter for a long time. Jonathan hadn't just been honoring her, he'd been honoring Margaret, fulfilling the dream his wife never got to complete. Sarah was the invisible writer Margaret had wanted to find, and Jonathan had found her. It made the gift more beautiful and more painful. Two people, both dead, both trying to do something good through Sarah. She wasn't just carrying her own story anymore, she was carrying theirs too. That realization changed something. Sarah stopped thinking about the book launch as an obligation she had to fulfill, started thinking about it as an opportunity, a chance to honor Jonathan and Margaret, a chance to use visibility the way Margaret had dreamed, to make other invisible people feel seen. She called Victoria. "The launch. I want to do more than just read and sign. I want to talk about invisibility, about people like me. I want to use this." Victoria was silent for a moment. "Sarah Morgan, you continue to surprise me." "Yes, absolutely yes. We'll build the event around that. This isn't just a book launch anymore, it's a statement." The last week before the launch, Sarah visited Amanda. She was out of the hospital, living with her parents, attending therapy, slowly rebuilding. When she saw Sarah, she hugged her hard. "I'm coming to your launch. I wouldn't miss it." "You don't have to, Amanda. I know crowds are hard. Your book saved my life, Sarah." Amanda pulled back, meeting her eyes. "The advance copy Victoria sent you. You gave it to me to read. The main character, the woman who feels invisible, who thinks she doesn't matter, that's me. That was me. And watching her find her voice, watching her matter, it made me think maybe I could too. So I'm coming. Because you need to know your words matter. Really matter." Sarah cried in Amanda's parents' living room, and Amanda held her, and for a moment, the terror of the upcoming launch faded into something else. Purpose. This is why she was doing this. Not for fame, not for money, for Amanda's, for people who needed to know they weren't alone. The morning of the launch arrived gray and cold, typical October in Portland. Sarah woke in Jonathan's apartment, in the bed she'd been sleeping in for 2 months now, and felt the terror slam into her immediately. Today. It was today. In 8 hours, she'd stand in front of hundreds of people and read her words aloud and be completely, utterly, unavoidably visible. She wanted to cancel. Call Claire. Say she was sick. Say she couldn't. Let the books publish quietly without her. Fulfill the technical requirement of one public appearance some other way, some smaller way, some way that didn't feel like stepping off a cliff into nothing. But she got up, showered, put on the outfit Claire had helped her choose. Simple black dress, cardigan, the kind of thing that said writer without trying too hard. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. This wasn't invisible Sarah. This was someone else, someone who mattered enough for people to pay attention. She took the note from her wallet. The one she'd carried for 6 years. Continue writing. The world needs these words. She read it one more time, then tucked it into the book she'd be reading from. A talisman. proof that once someone believed in her. Claire picked her up at 4. The launch was at 6. They arrived at the library at 4:30 for setup, and Sarah's heart stopped. The library was transformed. The main reading room, where children's story hour usually happened, where Sarah had read to toddlers 1,000 times in her invisible life, was full of chairs. Rows and rows of chairs. A podium at the front with a microphone. Lights. A table stacked with books, her books, with her name on the cover, The Weight of Invisible Things by Sarah Morgan. People were already arriving, lining up outside. Sarah watched through the window as the line grew. 50 people. 100. More. "They're here for you," Claire said softly. "All of them. Here to see you." Margaret, the head librarian, appeared, nervous and excited. "Sarah, this is incredible. I've never seen the library like this. The whole city is talking about tonight." Mrs. Patterson walked by. The woman who'd ignored Sarah for 15 years and actually made eye contact. "Good luck tonight, dear. I had no idea you were a writer." "Because I was invisible to you," Sarah thought. "Because I made myself invisible. But not anymore." Victoria arrived at 5:30, impeccable as always, and pulled Sarah aside. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified." "Good. That means you care. Sarah, whatever happens tonight, you've already won. Your book exists. It's real. People are going to read it. That's what matters. What if I freeze? What if I can't read? Then you'll freeze and I'll step in and we'll figure it out. But you won't freeze. You know why? Because you've been finding your voice for 23 years. Tonight, you're just using it out loud for the first time." At 5:45, Claire said it was time. Time to go backstage, to wait for 6 o'clock, to prepare. Sarah walked through the library, past shelves she'd organized 10,000 times, past patrons she'd helped and ignored her in return, and she felt like a ghost walking through her own life. The reading room was full, every seat taken, people standing in the back, cameras, local news, the Portland Tribune. Sarah could see Amanda in the 3rd row, smiling encouragement. She could see former co-workers, patrons, strangers who'd read the article and wanted to see the invisible librarian who wasn't invisible anymore. 200 people, maybe more, all here for her. The terror was absolute, physical. Sarah's hands shook, her breath came short. She wanted to run, actually run. Out the back door, into her car, away from this moment that felt impossible to survive. Claire touched her arm. "Breathe, you've got this." "I don't." "You do. And Sarah, Jonathan's watching. Make him proud." At exactly 6 o'clock, Margaret stepped to the podium, tapped the microphone. The room fell silent. 200 people, silent, waiting. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to what I think is one of the most special events this library has ever hosted. 28 years ago, Sarah Morgan started working here as a librarian. For 28 years, she shelved our books, helped our patrons, and quietly made this place better. What we didn't know was that she was also writing. 7 novels. 7 complete, beautiful novels that she kept secret. Until Jonathan Blake, one of America's greatest authors, discovered her. And now, tonight, we get to celebrate not just Sarah's first published book, but the courage it took for her to finally let herself be seen. Please welcome Sarah Morgan. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming. Sarah walked to the podium on legs that didn't feel like hers, looked out at 200 faces looking back, seeing her, really seeing her. She couldn't do this. She couldn't. But then she saw Amanda. Amanda, who'd said your words saved my life, and she saw the stack of books with her name on them, and she felt the note tucked in her copy of the book. Continue writing. The world needs these words. Sarah opened her book, found the page she'd marked, looked up at 200 people who were waiting to hear her voice, and she began to read. Her voice shook at first, but it held. And as she read, as she spoke words she'd written 23 years ago in secret, believing no one would ever hear them, something happened. Her voice steadied, grew stronger, filled the room. She was reading, out loud, in front of everyone, and she wasn't invisible anymore. Sarah read for 10 minutes. Her voice didn't break, didn't falter. She read the opening chapter of The Weight of Invisible Things, about a woman named Claire who worked in a flower shop and believed she took up too much space in the world, who made herself smaller and smaller until she almost disappeared completely. The room was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of boredom, but the breathless silence of people listening with their entire bodies. Sarah could feel them leaning in, following every word, living inside the story with her. When she finished the chapter, when Claire had just made the decision that would begin her transformation, Sarah closed the book and looked up at 200 faces looking back at her. The applause started slowly, then built. Not polite, not obligatory, real. Some people were crying. Amanda in the third row was openly weeping, smiling through tears. Sarah's own eyes were wet. She'd done it, read her words aloud, been visible, survived. Victoria stepped to the podium beside her. Sarah will take a few questions now. Hands shot up. Victoria pointed to a woman in the front, elderly, dignified. "Miss Morgan, why did you keep your writing secret for so long?" Sarah thought about the answer, the real answer. Because being seen is terrifying. Being judged is terrifying. It was safer to be invisible. But invisible is also lonely. And I think at some point the loneliness becomes worse than the fear. Jonathan Blake understood that. He gave me permission to be afraid and visible at the same time. Another hand. A young man, college age. "What would you say to Jonathan Blake now, if you could?" Sarah's throat tightened. "I'd say thank you, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for believing my words mattered when I was sure they didn't. And I'd say I'm sorry, that I wish I'd known him better, that I wish I'd been brave enough to talk to him more than just good morning and have a lovely day. But mostly, I'd say thank you." Victoria pointed to someone else, a middle-aged woman, professional, fierce expression. "Ms. Morgan, how do you respond to the accusations that you manipulated Jonathan Blake?" The room tensed. Sarah took a breath. "I can't control what people believe. Richard Blake has every right to his feelings, but I can tell you the truth. I never asked Jonathan for anything. Never knew he was leaving me anything until after he died. Never even knew who he really was until the attorney told me. Jonathan chose to see me, chose to believe in my writing, chose to do something extraordinary with his last months on Earth. That was his choice, not my manipulation. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that choice." The fierce woman nodded, satisfied. The room relaxed. One more question. Victoria pointed to Amanda. Amanda stood, shaking slightly. "Miss Morgan, your book, it talks about people who feel invisible, people who think they don't matter. As someone who felt that way, who your work helped, I want to ask, what do you hope readers take away from your stories?" Sarah looked at Amanda, at this young woman who'd almost died because she felt invisible, who was standing now, visible, asking a question in a room full of people. "I hope they feel seen," Sarah said simply. "I hope they read about these characters, these invisible people finding their voices and think, that's me, I'm not alone. I hope they understand that being invisible isn't the same as not mattering, that quiet lives are still meaningful lives, and I hope maybe they find the courage to let themselves be seen too, because the world needs their voices, all of them." The applause this time was different, deeper. People weren't just clapping for a good answer. They were clapping because they understood, because they'd been invisible too, because Sarah Morgan had just told them they mattered. The signing lasted 2 hours. 200 books, 200 people, 200 stories. A librarian who wrote poetry in the margins of checkout slips. A bus driver who'd been working on a novel for 15 years. A retired teacher who'd never shown anyone her memoir. A teenager who wrote in notebooks hidden under her bed. Each one approached Sarah's table and said some version of the same thing. I felt invisible too. Thank you for being brave. Your story gives me hope. Sarah signed each book carefully, personalized each one, made eye contact, saw each person, really saw them. Amanda was last in line. She'd waited, let everyone else go first. When she finally stood in front of Sarah, she didn't say anything, just placed her copy of the book on the table. Sarah wrote, "For Amanda, who taught me that being seen can save a life. Thank you for staying. The world needs you. Sarah." Amanda read it, started crying again, came around the table and hugged Sarah hard. They stayed like that for a long moment. Two invisible women who'd found each other, who'd saved each other in different ways. "Thank you," Amanda whispered. "Thank you," Sarah whispered back. The weeks after the launch were surreal. The book sold steadily, not explosively, but consistently. It wasn't hitting bestseller lists, but it was reaching people, the people who needed it. Letters arrived at the publisher's office, forwarded to Sarah. Emails through her new website. People sharing their own invisible stories, thanking her for making them feel less alone. The reviews were strong. A quiet masterpiece about the unquiet longing to be seen. Sarah Morgan writes invisibility with such precision that readers will feel simultaneously exposed and understood. This is what literature is for, to make us feel less alone. Richard's lawsuit was dismissed 8 weeks after the launch. The judge reviewed all the evidence, Jonathan's letter, his detailed notes on Sarah's manuscripts, testimony from his doctors that he was mentally sharp until the end, the timeline proving Sarah never sought him out. The ruling was clear. Jonathan Blake was of sound mind and clear intention. His bequest to Ms. Morgan reflects his values and judgment. This court will not second-guess a dying man's final act of generosity. Richard dropped the appeal. The money was Sarah's. The legacy was hers to carry. Sarah kept working at the library for 3 more months. Not because she needed the paycheck, but because it still mattered. Because there were still invisible patrons who needed to be seen. Because leaving immediately would feel like abandoning the life that made her who she was. But eventually, it was time. She trained her replacement, a young woman named Jennifer who reminded Sarah of herself 20 years ago. Quiet, attentive, seeing people other people missed. Sarah taught her everything. Which books to recommend to the suicidal college student. How to remember the crossword for the lonely widower. Where to leave the crisis hotline bookmarks. How to see the invisible. "You're not just shelving books," Sarah told Jennifer on her last day. "You're saving lives, quietly, without anyone noticing. But it matters. It all matters." Jennifer hugged her. "I'll remember." Sarah moved fully into Jonathan's apartment. It was hers now, legally and emotionally. She filled it with her own books, her own music, her own life. The piano became her daily ritual. 20 minutes every morning, relearning what she'd forgotten, playing through the stiffness until her fingers remembered joy. And she wrote. The 8th novel. This one about a man who spent 30 years in exile learning that silence wasn't the same as peace, that sometimes speaking up, even when it cost everything, was the only way to truly honor love. She also started a foundation, the Blake Morgan Fellowship for Invisible Writers, funded by a portion of Jonathan's inheritance, administered by people who understood that talent wasn't always loud or connected or obvious. The fellowship sought out writers like Sarah, working class, middle-aged, writing in secret, believing no one cared. The first recipient was Elena Rodriguez, 47, who cleaned office buildings at night and wrote poetry on her phone during breaks. Her work was extraordinary, raw and honest and true. The fellowship gave her $25,000 and 6 months to just write. No cleaning, no night shifts, just words. "I didn't think people like me got to be writers," Elena said when Sarah called to tell her she'd won. "People like us are exactly who should be writers," Sarah replied, "because we understand invisibility, and the world needs to hear from people who've been invisible. 6 months after the launch, Sarah returned to the library. Not to work, but for an event. The first annual Blake Morgan Fellowship reading, where recipients would share their work. The library reading room was full again, different people this time, but the same energy. People gathering to hear voices that deserved to be heard. Elena read a poem about cleaning toilets in buildings where important people made important decisions, about being invisible to people who mattered, about finding words in the space between seen and unseen. The room was silent, then thunderous applause. After the event, as people mingled and congratulated the fellows, Sarah stood near the fiction section, near the shelf where Pride and Prejudice still lived, where she'd read about Elizabeth Bennet's courage every Tuesday for 28 years. A girl approached her, 12, maybe 13, shy, wearing a hoodie despite the warm room. She clutched a notebook against her chest the way Sarah used to clutch hers. Protective, desperate, secret. Sarah recognized that gesture, knew it in her bones. "Hi," Sarah said gently. "I'm Sarah." The girl nodded, but didn't speak. "Do you write?" Sarah asked. The girl's eyes widened, nodded again. "What do you write about?" A whisper, barely audible. "Lonely people." Sarah's heart cracked open. "That's what I write about, too." "I know. I read your book. My mom bought it for me. She said maybe I'd like it because I'm always writing in notebooks." The girl paused. It made me feel less alone. Sarah walked to the shelf, pulled out a copy of The Weight of Invisible Things. The library kept several copies now, always in circulation, always reaching new invisible people. She took the girl's notebook gently, borrowed a pen from the circulation desk, and wrote on the first page, "For the one who writes in silence, continue writing. The world needs these words. You are not alone. You are seen. With understanding and hope, Sarah Morgan." She handed the book back to the girl. The girl looked at the inscription. Her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Lily." "Lily, the words you're writing matter, even if no one's reading them yet, even if you're scared to show them. They matter because you matter. Don't stop writing, okay?" Lily nodded, clutching the book like treasure. "Okay." Sarah watched her walk away, back to her mother who was browsing in the biography section, and she felt something powerful and bittersweet wash over her. This was it. This was what Jonathan had given her. Not just money or fame or published books, but the ability to see other invisible people, to be for them what he'd been for her, to continue the cycle of recognition, of validation, of saying, "You matter, your words matter. Keep going." She looked across the library to the table by the east window. Jonathan's table. Empty now, but not forgotten. Never forgotten. Sarah walked over to it, touched the back of the chair where he'd sat for 15 years, watching her, believing in her, preparing to change her life without her knowledge or permission. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty chair, to the memory, to the ghost of kindness that still lived in this space. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." Outside, Portland was going about its evening. People coming home from work, making dinner, living their small, normal lives. But Sarah Morgan wasn't living a small life anymore, wasn't invisible anymore. She was an author, a philanthropist, a person who mattered not just quietly but loudly, not just to a few, but to many. And yet, somehow, she was still herself, still the woman who'd shelved books for 28 years, still the woman who saw invisible people and tried to help them, just louder now, more visible, using her voice to make sure others could find theirs. She left the library not through the staff entrance, the door she'd used for nearly 3 decades, but through the front doors, the public doors, the doors that anyone could use. As she stepped out into the October evening, the air cool and smelling of rain, she thought about invisibility, about visibility, about the space between. Jonathan had pulled her from invisible to visible. Now she was pulling others. Lily, Elena, Amanda, countless readers who wrote to say, "I felt seen." The cycle continued. The legacy lived. And Sarah Morgan, who'd spent 53 years believing she didn't matter, walked down the library steps with her head up, her shoulders back, visible and present and entirely, completely, finally herself. The world had needed her words. Jonathan had known that. And now, so did she. So here we are. At the end of Sarah's journey. A woman who thought she was invisible discovering she'd been seen all along. A legacy of recognition passed from Jonathan to Sarah to Lily to whoever comes next. And now I need to ask you something. 3 questions, and I really want you to think about these. First, have you ever kept something, a talent, a dream, a truth, hidden because you were afraid of being seen? What would happen if you showed it to the world? Second, if someone like Jonathan appeared today and said, "The world needs what you're hiding," would you have the courage to reveal it? And third, the most important one, if you've been seen, truly seen by someone who recognized your worth when you couldn't see it yourself, have you told them? Have you thanked them? And if you haven't been seen yet, are you still waiting for permission, or are you ready to give yourself that permission? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Not for me, for each other. Because maybe your comment will be exactly what someone else needs to read today to find their own courage. Maybe you'll be someone else's Jonathan. Maybe someone will be yours. Now, about this channel. We have a community of people here now who believe in stories that matter. Stories with depth. Stories that make you feel seen. If you're a part of that community, if you value what we're building together, subscribe, not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because you're choosing to say, "Yes, I want more of this. More stories that remind me I'm not alone. More stories that give me permission to feel deeply." And if you've been here since the beginning, if you're one of the people who believed in Bittersweet Whispers when we were just starting, share this story. Not for views, but because you know someone who needs to hear about Sarah, someone who feels invisible, someone who's been writing in secret, living in secret, existing in secret, waiting for permission to matter. Next week, we have another story about a man named David Park, 58 years old, who spent 20 years as a janitor in a building where a CEO watched him from her window every night. And when she died, she left him $8 million and an architectural firm because she knew something about him that he'd forgotten about himself. But that's next week. Tonight, let me leave you with the words Sarah wrote in Lily's book, because I think they're for all of us. You are not alone. You are seen. Continue writing. Continue creating. Continue being. The world needs what you're carrying. Your story matters. Remember that. And thank you. Thank you for spending this time with Sarah, with Jonathan, with me. Thank you for being here, for being part of this community that believes stories can change lives. Until the next story. And remember, sometimes all it takes is one person seeing you, really seeing you, to change everything.